Okay. So welcome everyone to this our third year of this Parked at Home series. We are very excited and happy to be with you all once again. We have a tremendous lineup this year. I am very excited about the parks that we were able to get to agree to be part of this with us. We're going to go from everywhere from very South Florida in the one and only Everglades National Park to Amistad National Recreation Area in Texas, all the way up to the very gates of the Arctic at Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, way up in northern Alaska, Thomas Edison National Historical Park in New Jersey, and for those of you who are from Massachusetts, close to home, Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site. And of course, our guest this evening, I'm going to argue that there is no better park to be the first program in this series. First State National Historical Park. Come on, people, it's in the name. So we are very lucky to be joined this evening by First State National Historical Park. We share a lot in common with this park, and I'm very excited for where this discussion is going to go this evening. Just a few housekeeping things as we're getting started. Feel free to have your cameras on or off, whatever you feel the most comfortable with, but we do ask that everyone please remain on mute for the duration of the formal part of our presentation. Just cuts down on that background noise. It makes it much easier when editing the video for YouTube later. But that does not mean that we don't want you all to participate in our conversation this evening. Please type any questions or comments that you may have throughout the course of the presentation into the chat. And when we get into the second half of this evening's program, when we do a more informal discussion and conversation, we'll definitely be incorporating your questions and comments into that part of our discussion. If you are in need of any technical help, my colleague Jill Forrester is on the call this evening. She is our tech guru for the evening. So if you're having any technical problems or need any assistance with anything related to Zoom, definitely direct message her in the chat and she'll do her best to help you out with that. And most importantly, get comfortable, put your feet up, pop some popcorn. I don't know what the weather is like in Delaware, but here in the Blackstone River Valley, it's windy and a rainy night. It's a great night to be in and talking about all of these two tremendous parks and all the fun that we can have at these parks this summer, especially when the weather starts to get nice. I want to start first with an analogy, though. I want you to think of this object that you see pictured on your screen here, a water wheel. This is an image of the recreation water wheel, which is in the Wilkinson Mill, which is at one of our sites at the Old Slater Mill National Historic Landmark in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And I want you to think just of one of those buckets on that water wheel. And as that bucket fills with water, what happens? The weight of that water starts to push that wheel down, spinning it into motion. Then each consecutive bucket behind it also fills with water, pulling that wheel down and spinning that wheel into motion. And after a little bit, what happens to that first bucket that filled with water? It goes full circle. It comes back. It makes a complete revolution. And that revolution, that spinning of the wheel, produces power. Power that's transferred to machines, and those machines transform simple things like cotton into thread. Revolution and change. Both of the parks that we're discussing this evening are forged, are born in revolution. Both the American industrial and industrial revolutions played a key role in the profound change and upheaval which happened in our two parks historically. Pawtucket in 1776 was a little bit different than what would happen about a decade and a half later in 1790. But Pawtucket in 1776, on the very eve of the American Revolution and the War for Independence, was a community, a village of craftspeople who made things, harnessing the power of the river and transforming that power through the use of machines and creating products. Things as diverse as grist or anchors, iron forging operations, all happening along the banks of this waterfall in this small village. There was no Slater Mill yet, but people were still creating things. I'll save talk about what it means to be the first state to Samantha when we get to her portion of the presentation. But a little more than a decade later, after 1776, with the establishment of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, a new nation was being forged, a new nation was being created. Former colonies that had achieved political independence, but arguably had not yet achieved economic independence. Think of what the goal is of a colony. A colony's goal is to be exploited by the mother country, the country that colonizes it. So, although we had achieved political independence, there was still a long road to achieving economic independence from Great Britain. But the perp uh, and people who wanted to take steps in that direction towards achieving that economic independence, one of them was a Providence-based merchant by the name of Moses Brown. Moses Brown was of the prominent Brown family in Providence, and he decides that he wants to invest capital in purchasing textile machinery and renting a small workshop along the banks of the Pawtucket Falls. And by December of 1790, with the help of local machinists and mechanics like the Wilkinson family and a young English immigrant by the name of Samuel Slater, the first water-powered cotton spinning operation in North America became a success. So much success that 3 short years later, this very small wood-framed structure that you see sketched out here on your screen, just 2.5 stories tall, about 43 feet long, 29 feet wide, very humble beginnings of the American Industrial Revolution, Old Slater Mill was born, the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill in North America. But things did not change overnight. It took decades, really, for profound change to start to take hold here in the United States. And really, following the Embargo Acts during Thomas Jefferson's administration and the War of 1812, the need for domestically produced textiles, especially machine spun thread, had increased dramatically. And through the 18 teens into the 1820s, mills proliferated in the Blackstone Valley and beyond along the other major rivers and waterways here in southern New England. Families lived and worked in places called mill villages, and they made up the bulk of the workforces in these places. And slowly but surely, a new economic system began to develop, and the Industrial Revolution began to take hold. If we fast forward about a century and a half later, more dramatic changes were coming to the Blackstone River Valley as the landscape was once again transformed. By the 1980s, most of the industrial powerhouses and the companies that had once called the valley home, like the Draper Corporation in Hopedale, or the Whiten Machine Works in Whitensville, had moved on to other places to produce things. But the buildings, and more importantly, many of the people, were still here. And so by 1986, Congress made the decision to establish the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor, one of the first national heritage areas in the country. And by 2014, Congress decided to pull 6 important sites out of that National Heritage Corridor to establish Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park. And several years later, in 2021, Secretary Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, established the formal boundaries of Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park. 6 non-contiguous locations across the Blackstone River Valley, which helped to tell that story of the Blackstone River Valley as an incubator, an important hub of American industry and the development of the American Industrial Revolution. Similar to our story, another park forged in revolution and recently joining the national park system is First State National Historical Park. And so we are honored to have Samantha Baranski, the visual information specialist at First State National Historical Park, and a friend, I hope I can say, and colleague in the National Park Service, to join us to talk a little bit more about the awesome park that she works at.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm so honored to be the first presentation for this year's Parked at Home series. And when you reached out, I couldn't help but say yes. I absolutely adore Blackstone River, and I actually was able to get up there and see the park myself. So I love it. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing. To start off, with, I have a question for everyone, so I hope you can put your comments in the chat. My question is, what state was the last state to get a national park? So I'll pause just for a second. Couple guesses. All right, so for everyone who said Delaware, you are correct. So while Delaware is known for being the first state because we were the first state to ratify the United States Constitution, we were actually the last state to get a national park. It is one of my favorite trivia questions. Might be a little bias on it, but what goes into actually creating a national park? So in order to have a national park, there has to be two things that needs to happen. One, the federal government needs to own something. And two, there needs to be a nationally significant story, right? So different parks have different meanings. So state parks are typically more state focused, national parks, nationally significant. So what is the nationally significant story in Delaware? That was the big question. And also, at the time, the federal government didn't own anything. So we needed to own something and we needed to have that nationally significant story. And so for the owning piece of this, it started with our most northern unit called Brandywine Valley. The Brandywine Valley has more than 1,100 acres at the time that the park was created. It was originally owned by the Woodlawn trustees. And I'm going to go really quickly into history because we're going to also go a little deeper into Brandywine Valley at the end. And then it was eventually purchased by the Mount Cuba Center and then donated to the national park. So now we have something that the federal government owns, but we still need that other piece. So in 2013, the idea of First State National Historical Park was created. On the idea that when you're thinking about colonization and revolution, the real big thing that was missing from like the national story was the Swedes, the Dutch, and the Finns. So there's other national parks that already talk about the English. There's other national parks that already talk about colonization, but there was no national park that actually talked about the early colonization with the Swedes, the Dutch, and the Finns. So in the Delmarva Peninsula, there's the three entities who are trying to settle the area along the Delaware River that you see, and the Christina River as well. And then eventually the English come in and start to take control. So when First State National Historical Park was created, we consisted of three sites that helped to tell this nationally significant story. It consisted of the Newcastle Courthouse Museum, which is actually where William Penn, the English, first landed. So that's the time period it was initially starting at. Then it included the Brandywine Valley unit, which is the land that the National Park Service owned. And it also included the Dover Green, which is where Delaware ratified the United States Constitution, granting Delaware the title of first state. This happened in March of 2025 in 2013, by President Obama using the Antiquities Act. So the president only has the power to make a national monument. So in 2014, it actually got added to a bottom of a bill, and Congress changed and redesignated First State National Monument as First State National Historical Park, adding Fort Christina, an Old Swedes historic site, which really helped complete part of that national story of the Swedes and the Dutch, adding that really unique history that Delaware has into that story. And also the John Dickinson Plantation, which helped to really create that whole picture of how Delaware has played a nationally significant role in our country and the founding of our country. In 2020, we did have 250 acres that was also donated to our Brandywine Valley unit. So again, for State National Historical Park, we are famous for ratifying the United States Constitution first, but also that fight for power from the Swedes, the Dutch, the Finns, and the English. And the unique thing about all of it that was going on, and particularly when the English came in and when William Penn came in, is he still allowed everyone to practice their own beliefs. And so we had this really unique makeup in Delaware of a lot of diversity with different religions and nationalities and origins and independence and all of these different things. So I'm going to talk about the sides south to north. So on that map you just saw a second ago, we're going to start all the way down in Dover and work our way towards Brandywine Valley. So at the John Dickinson Plantation, this site is actually owned and operated by one of our partners, which is one of the things that makes us really unique with Blackstone, is that we are also a partnership park. So we work a lot with our partners, which means you won't always see a park ranger with a flat hat giving the programs, but that doesn't mean that the programs aren't just as special and just as great. So the John Dickinson Plantation is home to one of our founding fathers, John Dickinson. He was known as the Panem of the Revolution. There's a good walking path that you can do there, as well as take interpretive programs, take a tour of the house, and also the surrounding plantation grounds. A lot of the buildings there are currently now reproductions, which means that you can actually go inside. So I think that's cool because I like to be able to touch things. I'm one of those people. But there's a lot of different reproductions on the property. You can kind of get a sense for the size and scale of different things. So there's a log dwelling house right in hindsight of the mansion that John Dickinson actually grew up in. And so you can really get a sense for those different feelings of how that would have been to live in, as well as take guided programs. They do school programs. They love hands-on things, which is really exciting. The next site here is the Dover Green. This site was where Delaware actually gained the title of first state. So the Dover Green actually is the second capital of Delaware. Initially, the capital was in historic Newcastle and was eventually moved to Dover. So at the time when they ratified the United States Constitution, they actually didn't have a court building to vote in, so they actually did it inside the Golden Fleece Tavern. So Golden Fleece Tavern is not directly on the green, the original burnt down, but there is the sign on it, which is adjacent to where this woman is currently standing giving her guided program. They do a huge event, which is arguably my most favorite event of in the park, called Market Fair, where they actually take the green and they turn it back into an 18th century market. And they have a lot of reenactments going on, as well as a lot of homemade goods that people can purchase and entertainment as well. Now headed up to, this is in historic Newcastle. This building is actually really exciting. This is going to be the park's first visitor center. So this will be where you would go to actually start your visit at First State National Historical Park before you go out to any of the sites. But building is actually more important. This is where Delaware voted to separate both from Pennsylvania and Great Britain. So something that is really strongly known to all Delawareans is we were actually also the first state to separate from Pennsylvania and Great Britain ahead of July 4th. So one of the really big days here in Delaware is called Separation Day, where we celebrate and commemorate that happening. And that happened on June 15th of 1776. So almost an entire month before July 4th. It's almost like our own little mini July 4th holiday. But again, it's the idea of that nationally significance is what created that national park. And this is the room of where they voted to separate from Great Britain and Pennsylvania. The courtroom is actually still it's considered an active courtroom. So they can still have trials here in the courthouse. They don't typically host them anymore because of the way that the courtroom is set up. This is an English style courtroom compared to more modern day ones. Moving again a little farther north here is Old Swedes Church. So this church is about 2 blocks away from Fort Christina, and we'll talk about Fort Christina in a second. Old Swedes Church, though, was originally built by the early Swedish settlers, and it was actually built after the English had come in and taken over. But the Swedish government paid for it, and they did it because they wanted their citizens to still be able to practice the religion that they chose, and the English also allowed them to have that religious freedom and independence. Around the church is the original graveyard or cemetery of the early settlers. This is still an active graveyard. So there are still people being buried here at Old Swedes today, as well as far back as that early Swedish settlement. Fort Christina, this is the original landing spot of the Swedes. So while it's called Fort Christina, there is no fort here anymore. So if you go there, it's very much a commemorative space now. We don't actually know where the original fort was, but at Fort Christina, you can still walk this commemorative park, and then the monument itself, I just backed up for a second. If you really look at the monument, you'll see different sculptures around it, and each of those sculptures was designed in order to help tell that story of early colonization with the Swedes. And this monument is really cool. It was actually given by the Swedish prince at the time to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They do a lot of programs there as well, such as junior angler programs, and it's a great spot for fishing, particularly catfish if you like to catfish. And lastly, here is the Brandywine Valley unit. And I particularly saved this one for last because this is the one that ties in, I think, closest to Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park. So Brandywine Valley now is made up of 1,300 acres with 27 miles of trails, and it's in what's known as the Piedmont region. So while most of Delaware, southern Delaware is flat, northern Delaware, right next to Pennsylvania, actually has a lot of these really beautiful rolling hills and a lot of rivers and creeks. So at Brandywine Valley, there's a ton of trails to explore, a ton of different things that you can do. But the history of Brandywine Valley is something that can be often overlooked, and its role that it actually played in founding our country. So originally, Brandywine Valley was home to the Lenape, and they had a pretty good relationship with William Penn, who was an early Englishman who came over and was originally gifted Pennsylvania and the lower three counties, what we call Delaware today, from the King of England. Well, he had a good relationship with them. Eventually, that land was sold. Well, it was first reduced to a mile on either side of the Brandywine, which a mile's not very far. And then it was further reduced, and the land was eventually sold out to early Quaker industrialists. So we're still learning a lot about Brandywine Valley, but the first mill that we have any information on, we suspect was created in 1807. We have no idea what kind of mill it was or what condition it was in, because we are still learning about that. So while, again, going back to those rolling hills and the river, when those early Quaker industrialists came in, they saw the profit of that, and they started to really build this industrial area in the Brandywine Valley. So first constructing mills, then they started to mine, particularly mica was a very popular substance in the Brandywine Valley. And then more and more and more mills just started to appear in the Brandywine Valley. We had paper mills, textile mills, all different sorts of things. And similar to Blackstone, in order to actually support the milling industry and the agricultural use and the mining that was happening in the Brandywine Valley, we started to get different buildings that would support them. So they had their own little post office. They had their own school at one point. They had, buildings for all of the animals and everything that started to really happen. And at one point, this little industrial area in the Brandywine Valley was a huge, thriving industrial area for the city of Wilmington was actually sending products up to Philadelphia as well. So it was this huge thing happening, which really kind of elevates the Brandywine story from just some really unique hiking trails up to that nationally significant story and level. So eventually, those mills, as technology advanced, they did go out of fashion. Unlike Blackstone, we don't actually have any of the mills left. So if you do come to Brandywine Valley, unfortunately, you don't get to see any working mills, but you do get to see a mill at Blackstone, which is really cool. Uh, all of them either flooded, they burned, or somehow got destroyed before the land was donated to the Park Service. So the Brandywine Valley unit was originally purchased by William Peele Bancroft because he saw that the city of Wilmington was going to continue to grow. And so he also saw that the early Quaker industrialists were starting to sell off that land because they saw that the milling was going out of fashion and they wanted to get rid of it before they lost money. So William Peele Bancroft started to purchase a lot of these pieces of lands. He then realized that it was too much for him to manage it by himself, so he created the Woodlawn Company, which would later be called the Woodlawn Trustees. And then wrapping back into what I started with, the Woodlawn Trustees would then donate the land to the Rockford Woodlawn Fund. Mount Cuba Center would purchase it and donate it to the Brandywine Conservancy, and the Brandywine Conservancy would donate to the National Park Service. We really don't get land easily in the Park Service, but eventually it did get to us, and we did get First State National Historical Park created. So while we don't have active mills that you can see, the fall is one of my favorite times in the Brandywine Valley, as well as the winter, because you can actually see a lot of the hidden ruins and structures like in this photo. Uh, Otherwise, in the springtime, a lot of the leaves start to come in and it gets more difficult to find and to see those things. They don't become as transparent. So that was a ton of information. So Mark, if you're ready to kind of open it up to see what questions we have.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that, Samantha. I kind of knew a lot of this because I researched a little bit before this program, obviously, but now that you have talked about how much there is to see and do, I'm all that more excited to get out to First State and to see it firsthand. Um, I always kind of think of our parks in many ways as siblings, if you will, for a lot of reasons. One, we're made up of six different sites, that comprise a story that tells a bigger picture story that is nationally significant. We're born, if you will, out of the same legislation in 2014, albeit you kind of went down a little bit different path than us with the Antiquities Act and stuff that happened before, but born in December 2014, if you will. Um, and both really kind of focusing primarily on that early story of American development as a country, but also kind of the long-term implications of that, and kind of, I would argue, a legacy of conservation too, as well. So it's always so cool to hear how, these geographically separated parks share so much in common. If folks do have any questions, feel free to type those in the chat now, or any comments you want to hop in on the conversation. Definitely, you can start populating the chat. But I guess kind of for me as a start off question, you talked a little bit about the process of creating a visitor center, and both of our parks are kind of in a state of becoming in its early stages of what will this park be. And both of us are kind of building on different legacies that have been left by the people who live in those areas. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of this process of creating a visitor center, what that's looked like, any of the ups and downs that you've kind of experienced along the way.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite things about First Date is that so in all transparency, I have been at the park for 7 years now. I started as an intern in 2016 and am now still here in a different capacity, but very, very excited. Uh, so I've been able to see First State National Historical Park really start from this little baby national park. One of the really cool things is when national parks are created, they essentially just go, here you go. here's this thing. So we kind of start as just like babies, right? Like when you bring your kid home for the first time, you're like, okay, thanks. You have to learn it. And just like a baby, we have to learn everything, right? Everything is new. Everything is new to us. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we are. We're just trying to breathe oxygen and eat. Maybe get a nap in once in a while, right? So that's what the first 5 years are really of a national park. It's doing all of that, starting those initial researches, trying to figure out, get employees, right? Who's going to come in and just turn the lights on? And now we're into this part where we're like, okay, we know our national significance. We're starting to learn about our resources. Um, the Brandywine Valley unit that I just showed you guys, I was actually out hiking with some colleagues last year and we saw something in the woods and we were like, hey, what's that? So we went and looked at it and it was an old tractor. And then when we saw that, we saw a fence post and we're like, hey, what's that over there? So we went deeper into the woods, completely off trail. We're like, okay, wait. And then we're like, wait, there's something over there too. And we ended up finding all of these hidden ruins that we didn't know was there. So that's really what it is when you create these new national parks. It's learning and identifying. And one of the best ways for us to learn is from the local community and our partners. So they're the ones who have been there way before some of us have been there. Some of these people, they grew up in Delaware and they've been hiking these trails or they've been visiting these sites. And they know that they're there. So one of the easiest things that we can do is ask them. And our partners, we own the Brandywine Valley unit and the Sheriff's House, which is our visitor center. The rest of our sites are owned and operated by partners. They've been owned and operated by partners way before we were a national park. And so we often go to them for expertise. So with our visitor center, particularly with like exhibits and stuff like that, we send it out to them, ask them to review it, ask them to give us our feedback. Occasionally, we also have just champions in the community who are really, really engaged in the local history and know it very, very well, that we consider them subject matter experts, and we'll bring them into those review panels as well, because we want to make sure that we don't only get the information right, but that we're interpreting all of this local history who has been homes for generations and centuries to people correctly. At the end of the day, it's the American people's history. It's not just the National Park Service history. So we really got to make sure that we get it right.
Yeah, I think that all of us who work at Blackstone too can relate to that in its entirety. Your analogy of bringing a newborn baby home, a year and a half ago, I did the same thing, and it's kind of like, hey, there's no owner's manual, there's no directions here, and so trying to navigate those waters. And I think that you hit on a real key part of what we do in Blackstone as well, is the relying on partners and the people who are here, who know a lot about the story already, the people who grew up in many ways, some people even remembering working in a mill or in an industrial community and those firsthand experiences. And that's just institutional knowledge that you can't replicate, right? Firsthand knowledge of experiences and places. Um, and so that becomes a key part to how the story is told. And along those lines, too, I'm always kind of drawn in the Blackstone River Valley, the story of ZAP. 1970s, early 1970s, a grassroots movement of people who kind of take it upon themselves to collaborate, to work collectively, to begin the process of cleaning up the legacy of pollution in the Blackstone River Valley, and kind of this grassroots movement that does begin a shift, begins a change, and begins to change the river for better, and begins to push in a direction of national recognition, right? And I hear the story, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on it of um, Bancroft and the Woodlawn trustees in kind of a very similar light of a grassroots movement of people starting to advocate for preservation in what was an industrialized community.
Absolutely. And again, we're still learning a lot about history, so I might not be able to answer this question fully just yet, but one of the unique things, again, with William Bancroft is he had the foresight to be able to acknowledge that the city of Wilmington was going to continue to expand. So when you visit Brandywine Valley, it comes right off of this really busy, like we call it 202 corridor. So very, very busy, lots of restaurants and traffic and noise. There's a mall on one side. And then you turn and there's trees and there's birds and there's hills. And all the people just kind of start to slowly go away. And then you get out of your car and you can't hear a single thing. And so that's how close the city really was starting to get to Brandywine Valley, is right next door. And you can actually, if you can't see it from the highest hill in Delaware, but we did in one of our films, orientation films. We sent a drone up and we were able to actually see the city from Brandywine Valley. So again, that shows how close it is. So somehow William Pope Bancroft, he saw that this was going to happen. And at the time, it had to have been one of those like perfect timings things, foresight, because it was right as like the industrial era was starting to slow down. The mills were constantly flooding, they were burning. It was becoming too much of an investment to put money back into because it was just constantly being destroyed. And so as that industrial era started to go down, the early Quaker industrialists started to sell off that land pretty cheaply. With the exception of a lot of the local farmers in the agricultural industry there, they kind of retained a lot of their land. But even that, over time, they started to sell more and more of it off. And Woodlawn, uh, William Pope Bancroft, who established Woodlawn Trustees, they began purchasing those parcels as they could and preserved it. When they preserved it, they started preserving it just as it was. And then slowly, they decided that they needed to go over there. So they put in a utility path, right? And then eventually they put in another path to go over here, and it wasn't open to any type of hiking or anything. And then people started to say, like, hey, like, can we use your land? Can we come over here? So they slowly allowed recreation to happen. And at Brandywine Valley, you can ride horses, although we don't currently have any horse trailer parking. So you do have to figure out a way to actually get your horse there if you do come with them. You're allowed to mountain bike, which you actually can't do in a lot of national parks. So that's pretty unique to us as well as hike with your dog, with your friends, by yourself, whatever you prefer to do. And so those three things Woodlawn allowed. They also, there is this community in there where they allowed the community to help maintain the trails as well, which was very unique to the area. And so once this land was eventually donated, or not donated, purchased, and then donated to the National Park Service, those three different uses were still allowed. So the unique things is particularly with mountain biking, and this might be a little too policy for some people, so I apologize. But with mountain biking, the Park Service has to go through what we call an environmental assessment to determine if it can happen. For First State, it was grandfathered in that it could continue while we do that environmental assessment, which was very unique to us as well. And so these three user groups have been going on and interacting with no problems, which is pretty unheard of. A lot of times you start to get those inter-user conflicts and stuff, and our community has been able to really kind of get along and enjoy the area.
Yeah, that's great when people can come together to enjoy it, even if their background's different, and they have different recreating opportunities that they enjoy. I was also struck by when you said, you're kind of in the middle of a city and then all of a sudden you're in the woods. And I think that that speaks to a lot of what we have in the Blackstone River Valley as well. A heavily industrialized area, a very heavily urbanized area. And yet there are these pockets where you can totally escape along the river. And kind of really appreciate the natural beauty of the river, something that you don't expect usually in a Eastern park. You usually expect that more in a Western big national park. But we have a little bit of that too as well. and the repurposing of utility trails or things that were built for a company. I'm thinking of like the Blackstone Canal and the use now of large portions of the towpath of the Blackstone Canal along the railroad too, as well as a bikeway and opportunities like that. We have quite a few questions in the chat here that are related to, it seems like, the Brandywine unit and kind of that story. And one particular a question asking what were the primary industries in Delaware in the 18th and 19th century, what attracted settlers, and someone else was asking if the DuPonts were involved in the Brandywine Valley as well. Can you speak to any of those kind of what were the industries, do you know, to the best of your knowledge, and were the DuPonts there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can do the best. I'll try my best. Um, there's a report that national parks have called the Cultural Landscape Report, which is one of our founding documents for history, and ours is in the final stages of being drafted. And I have read some of that. Um, so I'll do my best to try to address all of those questions. So what attracted people to the Brandywine Valley? Again, those rolling hills and the winding rivers and the winding creeks, those, because of the rush of the river, a lot of people were coming and seeing that water power, and it's like the light bulb clicked in their head, right? That is a resource that they're able to use. They could easily set up a mill on this property and start generating income. As well as the Native Americans, the Lenape, they already had some areas that were being farmed. And so people started to see that the area had that really rich soil that would make great agricultural areas. So we had people coming in and they were starting to build these agricultural areas. We had people coming in and they were starting to build mills. Off the top of my head, there was textile mills and paper mills were, I think, the two most prominent ones that they had. There was a couple mills or cotton mills later, um, towards the end of the industrial area of the Brandywine Valley, but they initially started with the paper mills. And then the third big industrial thing that we had was mining. And they were particularly looking for mica was one of the most common ones. And so mica, I don't know if anyone's ever seen it. I wish I had a piece to actually show you all. But it actually, when you're looking at it, it almost looks like broken glass on the ground. It starts to shine. And a lot of times when I hike with people in the Brandywine Valley, I start noticing they start tippy-toeing around. And I have to point it out to people so that they feel safe stepping on it because it really does on a nice, really bright sunny day, almost like the photo on Mark's backdrop there. It'll just shimmer right off the ground and it looks just like glass. And so what they would do is they would start collecting all of the mica and they would turn it into different sheets, which could withstand a whole bunch of heat. So it was used a lot for like spark plugs and really anything that just would get really, really hot is what they were trying to craft it into. I know there was another question in there. What was the second one?
Someone asked if the DuPonts were involved in the
DuPonts.
Brandywine Valley.
So I believe that the DuPonts did own some land that's now owned by the National Park Service. I'd have to go back into the CLR and look to actually find their exact name. But right across from us is what's called Grenoble. That was just purchased by Longwood Gardens. That actually is an old DuPont estate. So they're directly across the river. What that estate was originally historically doing at the time, I don't know that off the top of my head because it's outside of the park boundary. But because of their proximity, I know that I read the DuPont name somewhere in that cultural landscape report. I just don't recall off the top of my head what exactly that was.
Cultural landscape reports, since you brought this up, it's a process that we're also going through too at Old Slater Mill, with a cultural landscape report of our district that is here in Pawtucket, historic structures reports, right? They are all tremendous resources for us as National Park Service employees. And I think one of my favorite jobs as an interpreter and educator is oftentimes you will read through these documents and they have a very specific purpose and they are written in a way that allows for the best care and preservation of these places in the long run, right? In mind with attention to detail and what is original, what is not, what is transformed on these landscapes or in these structures, right? What is original to these structures, what to pay special attention to. They are tremendous documents that most people will never read, right? So I wonder, can you speak to, and I know I have my opinions of this, but right there are these tremendous resources, but in many ways, it's our jobs as interpreters and educators to transfer some of that information to folks. So can you talk to us a little bit about that experience in your process? I mean, clearly you are exemplifying that here, but kind of what is that process like to translate some of that information to the public?
Absolutely. So I'll go back to my analogy with the baby and the toddler. So those the Cultural Landscape Report is one of those founding documents that really helps national parks kind of start to transition out of that youthhood towards adulthood type in our life that we can all relate to. You start learning what are the rules, what do you have, how do you protect them, what is significant, right? So one of the really cool things in our at First State is we have some tactiles or some arrowheads that have been donated to the park that were at one point collected. And uh, I am not an archaeologist by trade. I'm a visual information specialist, so I do a lot of digital media. So to me, I look at it and it looks like a rock to me. But one of the really cool things is that these reports, the Cultural Landscape Report, Historic Structures Report, I think I heard Mark say as well, they help you identify and be like, no, that's not a rock. That's actually an artifact and it has historical value and it's very significant. And our job as interpreters is a lot of times these documents come to us and they are true history papers, like the type of history paper you had to write in fifth and sixth grade, and or they're scientific papers like you had to write in high school, very, very technical language. And we get to literally interpret them, whether it's the science base or the history base, and turn it into interpretive products, whether that's content on our park websites, it's interpretive programs like what we're doing here today, or in the parks, in the fields, it's social media, our NPS mobile app, all of those different platforms that we use to connect with all of you and other visitors. We get that information from some of our foundational documents, as well as some of the research that we get to do off on the side as well to prepare for our programs.
I love the analogy of it takes us from toddler years into our teenage, into our growing years, into our adulthood. I love that analogy. In any of those documents, do you know of any maps? Another question was, are there any maps that depict where the buildings stood before they were destroyed? I'm assuming that that is referencing those buildings that you were talking about in the Brandywine unit.
So there are, and I say that kind of with the comma there on purpose. Um, some of that information comes down to what the superintendent decides that he can share. Sometimes we have to weigh the preservation of side of our mission with the National Park Service against the enjoyment. Um, as as much as I'd like to say no one is ever going to do anything to any of these things, sometimes people come with bad intent. So the Cultural Landscape Report is a public document once it is finalized. With that said, sometimes some information is redacted for certain safety or archaeological significance, as well as because we work with our federal tribes, we have to be very respectful of their history. And so that might be another reason that sometimes information is redacted. But anything that we can share, we will have maps up as well. One of the things that we also have coming down the line is a trail plan for the Brandywine Valley unit. So all of those trails, those were all inherited. We're just starting to ask, where should our trails go? Kind of that growing up thing again. Uh, and we're hoping that we can have some of those trails go by more of those culturally significant areas, such as like the ruins. Uh, and with that, then we'd really be able to have signage, maps, all of that to be able to interpret those more in depthly.
Awesome. And I know when we talk about preservation, right, critical in many ways because the more people that visit places, especially ruins, right, people are tempted to crawl on ruins or to do things that could actually lead to that historic integrity being destroyed over time. And I know in the Blackstone, we have numerous instances of abandoned buildings, right, and abandoned structures. And when things sit idle for a long time, that's when they tend to fall into disrepair and they tend to go away. So all the more importance for especially an agency like ours, if we're protecting historic structures, right, to be active in helping to preserve those structures for future generations. Someone on here asked if the Battle of Brandywine is near or related to the Brandywine unit. Is it in the park? Is it not in the park?
That's a great question. Uh, and it's a little confusing that we call ours Brandywine Valley as well as the Battle of the Brandywine because they both have that same word in it. Unfortunately, the Battle of the Brandywine is technically outside of the park boundary of the Brandywine Valley unit. Um, as far as I know, it's actually a little too outside to actually have any historical connection to it. We don't think that any part of that battle actually took place within the boundary of the park. However, that does not mean that we don't get to interpret that story and help tell that story as part of the larger First State National Historical Park significance, because our story here at First State really starts with the early colonization through the ratification, but also history didn't stop there. So one of the big themes with our new visitor center is towards a more perfect union. So always striving for that more perfect union. And so we have a lot of testing the Constitution, those types of themes throughout the entire park.
Very cool. I think that's one of the fun parts about partnership parks in many ways is that you're not always bound by boundaries per se, but how do the stories connect, right, into a broader picture? And I love that towards a more perfect union. We're getting near the end here. So, how do most people visit your park? What are any insider tips, tricks? If I wanted to show up at First State this summer, what should I know to make my visit the best possible visit?
Absolutely. So the first thing is avoid Monday and Tuesdays. Most of our sites are actually closed on Monday and Tuesdays, so it's really a horrible day to visit First State. Please, I beg you, choose any other day of the week but those two. Outside of that, I would really recommend coming, especially if you're going to come this summer. I would recommend coming for Separation Day. It's really a mini July 4th celebration. So all of the fun things that you love about that holiday in this really quaint historic district, the whole entire state gets really, really excited about it. It's a huge thing. I highly recommend attending that event. My second favorite event that I would recommend if you're trying to plan your visit is Market Fair, which is on the Dover Green, and I showed the image of that earlier. They really turn it back into 18th century market. The streets closed down. You can walk around. There's historical reenactments happening. We're usually there making corn husk stalls. Uh, we don't pick the corn from our fields. We cheat, but it's still a lot of fun. Uh, the other thing, there's two more points. I would visit now, whether that's this year, next year. Try to visit within that time frame if you can, and then come back and visit in 5 to 10 years. And I say that because similar to Blackstone, we're both young national parks. We're still growing into what we're going to be. We're growing into what we're going to be when we get older. Um, if you visit now, you can kind of see that like pre-national park stage still. And then in 5 to 10 years, you can come back and see what all has actually shifted to help us really reach our mission of balancing that preservation and enjoyment of the National Park Service. How have we done that here at First State? Because still currently on the ground, we're really just still in that what we got. But in 5 to 10 years, I think you're going to see that shift of where are we going? And I think that's a really unique thing that people don't get to see a lot in national parks because most national parks have been around for a long time and they already know what they are when they're an adult.
So true. We always say that with folks that your experience now will be so vastly different probably than what your experience in 10, 15 years from now will be. And hopefully we'll all still be at these parks to experience that too, along with the public. Um, so I started this presentation with the idea of a water wheel. One bucket making its way all the way around the circle of revolution. Our national parks, in many ways, are filled with stories of revolution. And I would argue that the stories of a revolution, whether it's going in a circle or a climactic political event, is a story of change. A water wheel makes a revolution, produces power, and that power causes a machine to spring to life, and those machines can transform something as simple as cotton into thread. Change can be one of the most difficult things, though, for us as humans to confront, but change is undeniably inevitable. As founding father Benjamin Franklin, a little shout out to the American Revolution here, once said, quote, "Change is the only constant in life. One's ability to adapt to those changes will determine their success in life," end quote. Both of our parks are in a state of change, in a state of becoming. I want to encourage you all to be involved in that change, to take an active role in our parks and the stories that are told in these places, because after all, they are your national parks. I want to thank you so much, Samantha, for joining us here tonight. I want to thank everybody who came out on this gloomy evening here in New England, for joining us here. The series is just starting. Thank you to the person in the chat who said they just stumbled upon this program. Welcome. I hope that you come to all 5 of the remaining programs. Next week, we are going to be joined by Everglades National Park. Cannot wait for that discussion. I worked in Big Cypress for a very short period of time. I went on a 3-month detail there. So the Everglades is pretty close to my heart. So I cannot wait for that presentation next week. We hope that you will all join us next week at 7 p.m. Same virtual room, same time. Although remember, this week we go ahead on the weekend, daylight savings time, that whole thing. So it'll technically be an hour in advance, but it'll still be 7 o'clock, just not standard time anymore, daylight savings time. At this point, folks, thanks for coming. If anybody wants to hang around and have a more informal discussion, we'll stop the recording here in a minute. We can all come off mute and have a little bit more of an informal discussion. But if you want to head out, thank you for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll hopefully see you next Thursday. Thanks, everybody.